Valdosta, South Georgia, September 15, 1987. The morning mist clung to the tobacco fields like cotton gauze, and Maggie Chen pulled her cardigan tighter as she stepped onto the porch of the farmhouse she'd called home for 3 years. At 24, she had traded her life as a teacher in Atlanta for something quieter, a fresh start in rural Lowndes County after her divorce. The red clay beneath her feet was still damp from the previous night's rain, and the smell of earth and curing tobacco filled the crisp autumn air. Maggie had found peace in the rhythm of small-town life. She worked part-time at the local library and spent her evenings tending to her vegetable garden behind the rented farmhouse. Her neighbors, the Harveys, owned the sprawling property next door, and their teenage son Danny often helped her with repairs around the house in exchange for her famous peach cobbler. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Maggie fed her tabby cat, Fitzgerald, and brewed coffee in the kitchen while listening to the local radio station. She had planned to drive into town to help organize the annual Harvest Festival at the library, then stop by Murphy's General Store for groceries. Her burgundy Honda Civic sat in the gravel driveway, keys hanging by the front door. But by 6 p.m., when Maggie failed to show up for her shift at the library, something felt wrong. Linda Morrison, the head librarian, called the farmhouse repeatedly. The phone rang and rang, echoing through empty rooms. Fitzgerald meowed from the porch, hungry and confused. When Linda drove out to check on her, she found Maggie's car still in the driveway, keys still hanging on their hook. The front door was unlocked, not unusual in rural Georgia, but inside, everything appeared normal. Too normal. Maggie's coffee mug sat half empty on the kitchen counter, still faintly warm. Her purse lay on the dining table, wallet and driver's license inside. A grocery list in her neat handwriting was folded next to it. Milk, bread, apples, cat food. The only thing missing was Maggie herself. By nightfall, when the Lowndes County Sheriff's deputies arrived, they found no signs of struggle, no broken windows, no disturbed furniture. It was as if Maggie Chen had simply stepped outside and vanished into the Georgia twilight, leaving behind only questions that would haunt the small community for decades to come. The search for Maggie Chen began at dawn on September 16, 1987. Sheriff Bob Whitfield organized volunteer teams that spread across hundreds of acres of farmland, pine forests, and swampy lowlands surrounding Valdosta. The temperature had dropped overnight, and search dogs followed scent trails that seemed to disappear into nothing near the old tobacco barn on the Harvey property, a weathered structure that had stood empty for over a decade. Linda Morrison coordinated efforts from the library, transforming the quiet building into a command center. Maps covered every available surface, marked with colored pins showing where teams had searched. Maggie's photograph, a sweet smile beneath dark bangs, was photocopied and distributed throughout South Georgia. Local news stations picked up the story, but in 1987, missing person cases rarely received sustained media attention unless there was evidence of foul play. The Chen family drove down from Atlanta, Maggie's parents speaking in hushed Mandarin with relatives who had flown in from California. They couldn't understand how their daughter, who had always been so careful, so responsible, could just disappear. Her ex-husband, David, was questioned and cleared. He had been at a conference in Jacksonville with dozens of witnesses. As weeks turned to months, the search efforts dwindled. The volunteer teams returned to their own lives, their own responsibilities. Sheriff Whitfield kept the case open, but with no leads, no evidence, and no body, there was little to investigate. The farmhouse where Maggie had lived was eventually rented to another family. Fitzgerald the cat was adopted by the Harveys. By Christmas of 1987, Maggie Chen had become another statistic, one of thousands of Americans who vanish each year without explanation. Her parents visited Valdosta every year on the anniversary of her disappearance, leaving flowers by the old tobacco barn where the scent trail had ended. They aged visibly with each visit, hope dimming in their eyes like autumn light. The community tried to move on, but Maggie's disappearance had left a scar. Mothers kept their children closer. Doors that had never been locked were suddenly bolted at night. The old tobacco barn, already avoided by local kids who claimed it was haunted, became even more of a forbidden place, a monument to unanswered questions. Linda Morrison never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would find out what happened to the quiet teacher who had loved books and gardening and had never hurt anyone in her life. She kept Maggie's library card in her desk drawer, never cancelled, never forgotten. 28 years would pass before that hope would finally find its answer. October 12, 2015, Valdosta, Georgia. Kyle Harvey, now 41 and the owner of his family's tobacco farm, squinted through his safety goggles as the demolition crew prepared to tear down the old barn. After decades of neglect, the structure had become unstable, its roof sagging dangerously. The county had finally mandated its removal after a severe storm the previous spring had damaged several support beams. The October morning was unseasonably warm, and Kyle watched as the excavator's massive claw bit into the weathered wood siding. He remembered playing around this barn as a teenager, though his parents had always warned him to stay away from the old root cellar beneath it. The cellar had been sealed with concrete years before Kyle was born, his father had told him, something about it being unsafe, prone to flooding. As the barn's east wall came down in a shower of splinters and dust, the excavator operator suddenly stopped. "Hey, Mr. Harvey," he called out, pointing to the ground where the wall had stood. "You might want to take a look at this." Kyle walked over and saw what had caught the man's attention. Where the concrete seal of the old root cellar had been, the constant pressure from the barn's settling foundation had created a crack, and protruding from that crack, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated dirt and debris, was something that didn't belong. The edge of a brown leather handbag. Kyle's blood ran cold. He knew that bag. He had seen it 1,000 times in his nightmares, in the missing person flyers that had yellowed on telephone poles for years after 1987. It was Maggie Chen's purse, the one Linda Morrison had said was found on her dining table the night she disappeared. But this was a different purse, smaller, the kind of bag a woman might carry when she was just stepping outside for a moment, not planning to be gone long. With trembling hands, Kyle called the sheriff's department. Within an hour, the demolition site had become a crime scene. Detective Maria Santos, who had transferred to Lowndes County just 2 years earlier, carefully excavated around the crack in the concrete. Using small tools and brushes, she slowly revealed more of the handbag. Inside, protected by the leather and the sealed environment, they found Maggie's driver's license, a small address book, and $23 in cash. But there was something else, something that made Detective Santos's heart race. A small appointment card from Dr. Williams' medical practice in Valdosta, dated September 15, 1987. On the back, in Maggie's handwriting, were 2 words, "Tell Mom." The appointment had been scheduled for 2 p.m. on the day she disappeared. According to the medical records Detective Santos obtained with a warrant, Maggie Chen had discovered she was 6 weeks pregnant. She had been carrying her secret and her hope in that small brown purse when she vanished 28 years ago. Now, finally, her story was ready to be told. The discovery of Maggie's purse opened a door that had been sealed for nearly 3 decades, but the truth emerged slowly, like water seeping through cracks in concrete. Detective Santos began by re-interviewing everyone connected to the original case. Most of the key players were still alive, though Sheriff Whitfield had retired and Linda Morrison was now in her 70s. The Chen family, who had never stopped hoping, drove down from Atlanta the day after the purse was found. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Danny Harvey, now 43 and living in Tampa, returned to Valdosta when he heard about the discovery. Kyle's older brother had been 17 in 1987, the teenager who had helped Maggie with odd jobs around her farmhouse. Detective Santos noticed he seemed nervous during their interview, his hands shaking as he answered routine questions. "I need to show you something," Danny finally said on their 3rd meeting. "I've been carrying this for 28 years. He led Detective Santos to his childhood bedroom in his parents' house, now a storage room filled with boxes and old furniture. From beneath a loose floorboard, he retrieved a shoebox wrapped in plastic bags. Inside was a composition notebook with Danny's diary, private, written on the cover in teenage handwriting. The entry, dated September 15, 1987, told a story that had been buried with Maggie's purse. "She told me about the baby today, said she was scared, didn't know what to do. The father was married, someone from the library board who visited when Mrs. Morrison was at meetings. Maggie said she could never tell anyone because it would ruin his family. She was going to leave town, start over somewhere else. I told her she should tell Mom and Dad. They could help her. But she just cried and said some secrets are too big to share." Detective Santos's investigation led her to the library board records from 1987. Only 3 married men had served on the board that year. 2 had died in the intervening decades, but the 3rd was still alive. Thomas Brennan, now 71, who had been the town's most prominent real estate developer. When Detective Santos knocked on Brennan's door on a cold November morning, she found a man who looked like he had been waiting for this moment for 28 years. His wife had passed away the previous spring, and he was living alone in the large house that had been his pride and joy. "I knew someone would come eventually," he said, not asking why she was there. In his study, surrounded by photos of his children and grandchildren, Thomas Brennan finally told the truth about September 15th, 1987. He had arranged to meet Maggie at the old tobacco barn that afternoon after her doctor's appointment. She wanted to tell him about the pregnancy, and he had panicked, not about the baby, he insisted, but about what it would mean for his family, his reputation, his business. "I just wanted her to leave town quietly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I offered her money, a new start somewhere else, but she said she couldn't run away anymore, that she was tired of keeping secrets. She said she was going to tell her parents everything, maybe keep the baby." The confrontation had escalated, not to violence, Brennan insisted, but to desperation. She turned to walk away, and I grabbed her arm, just to make her listen. But she pulled away so hard, so fast. She fell backward, hit her head on the concrete edge of that old root cellar. Brennan had checked for a pulse, tried to wake her, but Maggie Chen was gone. In his panic, he had broken the sealed concrete, hidden her body in the root cellar, and sealed it again using materials from his construction business. He had taken her small purse, the one she had carried to their meeting, and buried it with her. "I've thought about her every day for 28 years, Brennan said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I've thought about the baby that never got to be born, about her parents who never got to say goodbye. I became successful, had a good life, but I never forgave myself." Thomas Brennan was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter and concealment of a body. He pleaded guilty at his arraignment, refusing a plea deal that might have reduced his sentence. "It's time," he told his lawyer. "It's time for the truth." On March 15th, 2016, what would have been Maggie Chen's 53rd birthday, her remains were finally laid to rest in Atlanta beside the small marker her parents had placed years earlier. The inscription read, "Margaret Chen, beloved daughter, teacher, friend." Her story finally found its voice. Linda Morrison, now retired but still sharp, spoke at the memorial service. "Maggie believed that every story deserved to be told," she said, "even the ones that take 28 years to finish." The old tobacco barn was never rebuilt. The land where it stood became a small memorial garden, maintained by the community that had never forgotten the quiet teacher who loved books and gardens and had kept a secret too heavy for her heart to carry alone. Lowndes County Courthouse, August 2016. The summer heat pressed against the courthouse windows as Thomas Brennan's trial began, but inside the packed courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with something heavier than humidity. 29 years after Maggie Chen's disappearance, the small community of Valdosta was finally getting answers, though not everyone was prepared for what they would hear. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh had built her case carefully. The physical evidence was limited. After nearly 3 decades, forensic analysis could confirm the cause of death, but little else. What she had was Brennan's confession, his detailed diary entries that Danny Harvey had surrendered to authorities, and a pattern of behavior that painted a picture of a man who had spent decades living with unbearable guilt. The courtroom was divided in a way that reflected the complexity of the case. On one side sat Maggie's family, her parents, now in their 80s, flanked by relatives who had flown in from across the country. Her father, Henry Chen, held his wife's hand as they listened to testimony about their daughter's final day. They had learned not only how she died, but about the grandchild they would never meet. On the other side, Thomas Brennan's children and grandchildren struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the truth being revealed. His daughter, Susan, wept openly as Detective Santos testified about finding her father's business records, which showed he had purchased concrete and tools on September 16, 1987, the day after Maggie disappeared. "My father taught me about honesty," Susan whispered to reporters during a recess. "He built playgrounds for our schools, donated to every charity drive. How do you reconcile that with this?" The most compelling testimony came from unexpected sources. Dr. Williams, now retired, testified about Maggie's appointment on September 15th. "She was nervous but not distressed," he recalled. "She asked about options, about support groups for single mothers. She seemed to be considering keeping the baby." Linda Morrison, despite her age, provided the clearest picture of Maggie's state of mind in her final weeks. She had been attending library board meetings more frequently, Linda testified. She seemed to be paying special attention when Mr. Brennan spoke about development projects. At the time, I thought she was just interested in how the new subdivisions might affect library funding. The defense attorney, appointed by the court after Brennan dismissed his private counsel, argued for the minimum sentence. My client has lived with this burden for 29 years, he told the jury. He built a successful business, employed hundreds of people, contributed to this community. He could have taken this secret to his grave, but his conscience wouldn't let him. But it was Brennan himself who provided the most devastating testimony. Against his lawyer's advice, he took the stand on the final day of testimony. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he described the events of September 15th, 1987. I want everyone to understand that Maggie Chen was a good person who didn't deserve what happened to her, he said, looking directly at her parents. She was trying to do the right thing, and I was only thinking about myself. I've spent 29 years building a life on top of her grave, and not a day passed that I didn't think about confessing. I was just too much of a coward. When Prosecutor Walsh asked why he had finally admitted the truth, Brennan's answer silenced the courtroom, because when they found her purse, I realized that Maggie was still trying to tell her story. She wrote, "Tell Mom" on that appointment card. She wanted her mother to know about the baby. I had no right to keep that secret anymore. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Thomas Brennan guilty of involuntary manslaughter and concealment of a body. Judge Patricia Coleman sentenced him to 12 years in prison, the maximum allowed under Georgia law for the charges. As bailiffs led him away, Brennan stopped in front of the Chen family. Henry Chen, Maggie's father, looked up at the man who had stolen their daughter's future. For a long moment, the two elderly men stared at each other across an ocean of grief and regret. "I'm sorry," Brennan whispered. Henry Chen nodded slowly. "She would have been a good mother," he said simply. Outside the courthouse, Detective Santos was surrounded by reporters asking about the case that had consumed her life for nearly a year. "The truth doesn't always bring closure," she said, squinting against the afternoon sun, "but it brings justice. And sometimes that has to be enough." Valdosta, Georgia, September 15th, 2022. 5 years after Thomas Brennan's conviction, the Maggie Chen Memorial Garden had grown into something beautiful and peaceful. The space where the old tobacco barn once stood was now filled with flowering dogwood trees, park benches donated by the community, and a small reading nook that the current librarian maintained with donated books. Linda Morrison, now 81 and using a walker, still visited every year on the anniversary of Maggie's disappearance. She was joined this year by Detective Santos, who had been promoted to captain but still considered the Chen case the most important work of her career. "I read that Thomas Brennan was granted parole," Linda said as they sat on one of the memorial benches. "He'll be released next spring." Detective Santos nodded. "His lawyer says he wants to leave Georgia, start over somewhere else. His children have forgiven him, but I don't think this community ever will." "Forgiveness is complicated," Linda replied, watching as a young mother read to her toddler under one of the dogwood trees. "Maggie's parents visit twice a year now. They've gotten older, more fragile, but they always bring flowers. Her mother told me last spring that she dreams about the grandchild sometimes, a little girl with Maggie's eyes." Danny Harvey, now 49, had become an advocate for missing persons families. He used his experience with carrying secrets to counsel families dealing with cold cases. "Guilt has a weight to it," he often told them, "but truth, even painful truth, can set that weight down." Kyle Harvey had donated the land where the memorial garden stood to the county, with the stipulation that it would always remain a place of peace and remembrance. The Harvey family farm still operated around it, but the memorial had become a place where people came to think, to remember, and sometimes to confess their own secrets. The Valdosta Public Library had established the Margaret Chen Teaching Fellowship, providing grants to help teachers in rural communities. Linda Morrison had insisted on the specific wording of the dedication plaque: "For educators who believe every story deserves to be told and every student deserves to be heard." On quiet evenings, when the last visitor had left the memorial garden, some residents claimed they could still smell the faint scent of peach cobbler drifting on the wind, Maggie's recipe that she had shared with so many neighbors during her brief time in Valdosta. Whether real or imagined, the scent served as a reminder that some stories, once told, echo through generations. Maggie Chen's story had taken 35 years to reach its conclusion, But it had finally found its voice in the Georgia soil, where she had planned to build a life, raise a child, and grow old surrounded by books and gardens and the quiet contentment she had sought after her divorce. Thomas Brennan would serve his time and eventually be released, carrying the weight of his actions for whatever years remained to him. The Chen family would continue their annual pilgrimages, finding what peace they could in finally knowing the truth. And in the memorial garden, under the dogwood trees that bloomed every spring like promises of renewal, Maggie's story would continue to remind visitors that truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of working itself back to the surface, patient as seeds in winter soil, inevitable as the changing seasons, and ultimately as necessary as breathing itself. The last entry in Detective Santos's case file, written on September 15, 2022, read simply, "Case closed. Justice served. Story told. May she rest in peace." But some stories, once they find their voice, never really end. They just become part of the landscape, part of the collective memory of a place and its people, reminding everyone who hears them that every life has value, every disappearance leaves a hole in the world, and every truth, no matter how painful, deserves to see the light of day.